Hello everybody, welcome back to another video by Jay Bowman. Today I'm going to be talking about one of my favourite synths, which is the Mask1 by Kadamo, and it's going to be a bit of a different video today because this is a reaction to the new release just announced today by Kadamo of the desktop version of this synth. So I'm going to be calling this keyboard synth the Mask1 Old School from now on, because today Kodamo have also announced the release of the Mask1EX, which is the desktop version of this synth. So let me start this video by saying I'm not affiliated with Kodamo in any way. Everything that I say in this video is going to be my own opinion. Obviously I have used their synthesizers extensively. I've released 2 sound banks for the Mask1 through Kadamo, through their website. I assume that all of the sounds that I've released will work on the Mask1EX just the same as they do on the Mask1 desktop. I assume that's the case. I assume that the engine is pretty much identical except for the differences, which I'm going to talk about in this video. So having said that, although I've never tried the desktop, I think hopefully I can make some informed analysis based on what I know about the Mask1 Old School. So let's talk about the comparison of the specification that was released on Kodamo's website. So the first difference between the Mask1EX, the desktop version, and the Mask1 Old School is that the polyphony on the Mask1EX is 10 voices, whereas the polyphony on the Mask1 Old School is 12 voices. Interestingly enough, I think when the Mask1 Old School was first released, the polyphony was only 10 voices, but that was subsequently increased via a firmware update up to the current 12 voices. Now, is the difference between 10 voices and 12 voices going to be significant? What I will say about the Mask1 Old School is that it's got quite a smart way that it allocates voices between patches. So obviously the Mask1 is, this version, the Old School version, is 5-part multi-timbral essentially. So you might think that 12 voices would not go very far between 5 parts, but it's quite smart the way it allocates the voices. On my chord prologue, for example, which has 16 voices, you only have, it's fixed as 8 voices for each layer, essentially. So if you want 9 voices on one layer and 7 on the other, you can't do that. It's just 8 and 8. Whereas on the Mask1, it quite smartly allocates the voices between the parts. And I can say that having used this extensively, including in multi-timbral setups for years, I've never really experienced voice stealing, at least not in a way that has ever affected me, potentially. But having said that, I think where you might start to notice it, obviously, is with pads with long release. So if I just call up this pad, which I made recently, so I've got 2 voices in the bass and 3 in the right hand, so obviously just playing the same chord with the bass notes over and over again. I don't notice any voice stealing on the Mask1 Old School with 12 voices. Will that be different on the Mask1EX? Possibly you might notice more voice stealing in that kind of situation. But it doesn't seem to me to be a huge difference. Particularly when we get to the difference, when we consider how different the 2 synths are in terms of multi-timbrality, which we'll get to later, because the next difference on the comparison on the Kodamo website is the oversampling. Now to me this is the most intriguing difference between them, because it's apparently the oversampling on the Mask1EX is 8 times, whereas the oversampling on the Mask1 old school is 16 times. And I think this is interesting because it potentially impacts on the sound quality. Now I consider the Mask1 has a kind of very distinctive hi-fi digital sound to it, which can get crunchy in particular bit masks and using particular combinations of effects like the distortion, the bit crusher and the ring mod. So from that perspective, I wonder whether the oversampling difference might have some positive impacts in that it'll let you get more grungy, add more kind of dirt to the sound than you get on the Mask1 old school, which is quite clean and hi-fi, as I say. And in terms of aliasing, I think the Mask1 is pretty good, so I wonder whether aliasing will be more of an issue with the desktop version because of the difference in oversampling. I don't know. I'm not an audio engineer. I don't completely understand what the difference is there in terms of oversampling. I also would say that one of the great things about the Mask1 old school is the filter. I've just put it on an init patch. Let's just try the filter. Obviously it's a completely digital filter, and my understanding is that it's quite computationally expensive to make such a high quality digital filter. So let's just play with the filter for a bit. So if the reduction in oversampling is going to have an impact on the filter, then that could be more of a negative, I guess. So we'll just have to wait and see. As I say, I've not played the desktop version of this synth. I've just seen a short demo on YouTube, but I've got no idea how the actual sound will differ between the two units, and that would be something I'd be really interested to experience and look at, but unless I buy one for myself, I suspect I just won't get to experience that. So it'll be something that I'll have to rely on other people to to try and make a judgment call about. So going through the specs on the website, the next difference is in terms of multi-timbrality, and this is, again, this is a big difference. So the Mask1 multi-timbrality is 5, they say 5, but in brackets, 4 MIDI channels plus a layer or split. And I've made a video on my channel before looking at how to use the Mask1 in a multi-timbral way with a sequencer. So if I remember, I'll put a link to it here so you can check that out. And I would say the multi-timbral aspects of this synth are really good. I mean, I made an album with this synth where I was just using it in a monotimbral way. I wasn't sequencing it at all for my album Masquerade, and it's really good in that way. But then once you get into using it in a multi-timbral fashion with a sequencer, it's really quick to allocate voices to different MIDI parts, and in some ways it's very powerful in terms of being able to quickly set up multi-timbral setups in that way. Check my video. I go into the advantages and the disadvantages of the multi-timbral setup. Hopefully the disadvantages are something that Kadamo could improve with a future firmware update. But anyway, that's enough. Let's just suffice to say that in terms of multi-timbrality, the Mask1 old school is one of my favorite synths, just because of the number of parts and the ease of setting them up. In terms of the desktop, now that's saying it's 2-part multi-timbral, i.e. 1 MIDI channel, layer or split. So that's basically getting you to what the chord prologue is like, essentially. So you have 1 MIDI part and you can layer or split it, which is, yeah, as I say, that's how the chord prologue works. So that's great for layering pads or having, you know, drum kit, just this kick and a snare, whatever. You can do lots with that, but it's not the same as having essentially 5 voices playing at once, which really lets you lay out an arrangement before you commit it to audio, which is one of the advantages of the Mask1 old school. So that's a clear win for the keyboard version. So the next parameter is user memory slots. Now, for the Mask1 old school, that's 600 slots. For the Mask1 desktop, it's 200 slots. It's not the end of the world only having 200 slots, because there is a web librarian that lets you switch patches in and out reasonably easily. You do have to connect to a laptop to do it, obviously, but you can back up banks and then load them in and out. But I would say having 600 slots is great. And I think when it was first released, it only had either 400 or 500, and then they increased that in a recent firmware update. And 600 is great because this synth is very easy to make patches on. That's part of the design mission, and it means that you fill up slots very easily. I mean, so far I've only got 44 patches on my Mask1 old school at the moment, but that's because periodically I just go through and wipe everything, because I like to start from scratch. The way I work with this synth is I don't generally try and use pre-existing sounds. I have a sound in mind, I make it, and then I use it in the music. That's how it's designed to work. And because of working in that way, you do fill up the slots very quickly. For example, every time I want to do some drums, I just make the drums from scratch. I don't go and search for a particular kick or snare, just because it's so quick and easy to do it that way. It's quicker to make the sound I hear in my head rather than taking a pre-existing patch and modifying it. So yeah, from that perspective, 600 slots is obviously much better than 200, but 200 is fine. It's a smaller synth. You're going to have to connect it to a MIDI keyboard or a sequencer or your computer. So swapping patches in and out is not going to be that big a hassle, I think. And then obviously the last parameter on the list of differences between the Mask1 Old School and the Mask1EX is that obviously the desktop version, the EX, is a module, whereas the Mask1 is a keyboard. And I suppose it's worth talking about this a bit because I'm having to make a decision. Am I going to get the desktop or am I going to stick with the keyboard? And I think for me, probably I'm going to stick with the keyboard. Unless it emerges that the sound quality difference between them is such that you really want to have both of them. And one of the reasons for that is because the keyboard is high quality. I don't use velocity that much or aftertouch that much, but it uses both of those great. It's got great pitch wheel and mod wheel. They're off the camera so you can't see them, but they're there. But then also it's just a really compact but high quality keyboard. So if let's say in theory I sell the Mask1 Old School and get the Mask1EX, then probably I would be using the EX with my key stage, and the camera angles are not going to be great for doing an accurate comparison, but you just got to take my word for it. The key stage I've got is the 4-octave version. And obviously it's got polyphonic aftertouch, but I don't think the EX is going to respond to polyphonic aftertouch, so that's not a reason to get it. And the key stage is the 4-octave version. Obviously it's got the mod wheel and pitch wheel off to the side rather than above, like the Mask1 has them above the keyboard. But this 4-octave keyboard is, I'd say, it's only 3 keys smaller in terms of width than the Mask1. The Mask1 has a very narrow profile, which is great if you've got limited space. And also in terms of depth, again, the Mask1 is maybe a couple of centimeters deeper than the key stage. And it's really good in that way, in that it takes up relatively little desk space for what's quite a powerful synth. And the other thing I'd say in terms of the octaves, these bit masks have a very different quality depending where you play them, or some of them do, depending on where you play them on the keyboard. So let's just show that. If I start with Mask1. So it's great to have that kind of range of sounds. One of the really unique things about the Mask1 is how much range you have in terms of pitch control over the oscillators, over the sounds. So you can go from -60 semitones, so -5 octaves, up to +60, +5 octaves, just in the bit mask oscillators themselves. Then if you go into general, you can go -3 octaves or +3 octaves there. So what's that? -8, +8. Then in global, I think you have a further, did I imagine that? Yeah, in global you can go further octave down or octave up. So that's 9 octaves plus or minus. Then you've got octave keys there, octave buttons. So you can go 1, 2, 2 octaves down, or 2 octaves up. So 11 octaves altogether, plus the 5 octaves on the keyboard. So the range you've got is just crazy. So that's one of the advantages of having a 5-octave keyboard rather than a 4-octave keyboard, which I've got on the key stage. If I had a 5-octave key stage, then it would be bigger than the Mask1, plus I'd have to have the desktop module there in front of me, so it's taking up a lot more space than just having the old school keyboard here. which is great. And yeah, so for that reason, I don't think I will be getting the Mask1EX unless, as I say, it emerges that the sound quality differences between them are such that you really want to have both of them, or there's a real distinction between them. One of the things which would have made, I would say, though, for someone who doesn't have the Mask1 old school, I think the EX is a really tempting proposition because it's, what, €300, whereas I bought this for about £2,000, I think, and I think now that I've invested that money, taking into account what I'd lose if I tried to sell it and then get the EX, I think I'm best off just sticking with the keyboard version. But for someone who doesn't have this already, I think it's a lot more enticing proposition to get the desktop version and just use it with whatever keyboard you've got. Things which would have tempted me to get the desktop version over this is if they had made some hardware changes to hardware or software changes. But in terms of hardware, things I would have liked to see were more audio outs. For example, although the Mask1 old school is 5-part multi-timbral, it's only got a left and a right out. So for the desktop, they could potentially have gone to 8 outs like they've got on the Essence FM, which is a desktop synth. Or they could have used audio over USB potentially. So if they'd improved the audio outputs, for example, that would have been something that would have tempted me. If they'd have had a expression pedal input, then again that would have tempted me, because the Mask1 old school only has a sustain pedal input. I'd love to see an expression pedal input with more modulation options. That's something I love on the Prologue, which is in some ways quite a limited synth, but the fact that it's got expression pedal input is really good. I use that quite often when I play the Prologue. The user interface, from what I can see, is they've kept it exactly the same. I mean, I've not done a detailed one-to-one comparison, but looking at it, it looks like Kadamo have literally taken this section of the Mask1 and put it in a standalone format. And that's great in some ways, because I think the user interface is great. I know some people have their issues with it, they don't get on with it. But for me, I think the user interface is really good. Again, something that would have tempted me more to get the desktop is if they'd made some changes to the interface, not necessarily adding more knobs, but there are things that could be really great, improvements to the UI which could be really great. For example, a keypad. So if you know the value that you want to enter, you can just tap it in quickly. That would make it even faster to program. Also, the interface is good in that most of the changes, I mean, you've only got one value knob, so you're always going between whatever parameter you're changing and the value knob. I can't quite reach, though, from the value knob to this oscillator 1 button. So if they changed the user interface in a way that made it so that everything was within kind of easy tapping distance of the value knob, then again, I think that would have been an interesting change. Something I'm slightly surprised they didn't do is that I've looked at this layout of the buttons before and thought, you've almost got a kind of keyboard here, with the white keys down here and then the black keys up here, because you've got the 2 octave keys there. So I thought when they did a desktop version, possibly they would have made it so that you could just enter notes using these buttons without having to have a keyboard with you, just in case you want to just do sound design without having a keyboard. But it doesn't look like they've done that from what I could see. But you could see how you could have an octave and a half worth of keys using these buttons, potentially. So I would say there were things they could have done with the desktop version that would have been more tempting to me, and those things would have pushed it into being more of a premium alternative to the Mask1 old school, whereas it's not that at all. It seems to me to be very deliberately a stripped down version of the Mask1 interface, which is intended to tempt more people into the system, and I think that's great. I think if they get more users, more players, then that's good for them and good for existing owners of their synths. So I'm all for that. But for the reasons I've explained, for me personally, as someone who already owns the Mask1 old school, I don't think the desktop makes a huge amount of sense for me. So those are my thoughts on the announcement today. I want to say congratulations to Kadamo. I think it makes a lot of sense, and I hope this is going to be a big success for them. I'd love to see more synths from Kadamo, because I think the two they've made so far have been absolutely outstanding, and hopefully this is a step towards them doing that. And if you've enjoyed this video, please do give me a like and a subscribe, and hopefully I'll catch you on the next one. I hope this has been useful if you're thinking about getting the Mask1EX, or if you already have the Mask1 old school and you're comparing it and trying to work it out, which one you keep, which one you go for, then hopefully this has been useful. And let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'm happy to answer questions. I know that, the Mask1 is a relatively esoteric synth, so there's not a huge number of these out in the wild. In the UK, music shops have been shutting down recently, so it's very difficult to even get to go and see one and play one of these in person. So, if anyone's got any questions that I can answer, I'm happy to do that in the comments. So yeah, I'll just say once more, thank you very much for watching, and catch you on the next video. Goodbye.